Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into American tariffs, strategy, and history. Trade policy can often feel like just another abstract headline, but we're going to break down exactly how it functions, who's actually footing the bill, and why looking back at the 1930s proves this is one of the most powerful economic levers in the entire world. Let's get right into it. Here's our quick roadmap. We'll start with how American tariffs work, move on to the Great Tariff Debate, tackle the specialized goods problem, look at the echoes of the 1930s, and finally, compare today versus the past. All right, Section 1, how American tariffs work. Okay, so the absolute most crucial thing here is clearing up a super common misconception right off the bat. Foreign nations do not pay tariffs. American importing companies do. A tariff is literally just a tax paid right at the border by a domestic importer. And, well, because businesses kind of need to maintain their profit margins to survive, that tax usually gets passed right along to you, the consumer, through higher retail prices at the checkout counter. But it's not all just about making money for the government. In fact, government revenue is really just one slice of the pie here. Strategically speaking, these taxes are deployed to protect domestic industries by making those foreign goods more expensive. They're basically a tool to secure critical supply chains. Think about it. It incentivizes companies to build factories for vital tech, like semiconductors or green energy, right inside the US so we aren't relying on adversaries. Plus, they counter unfair trade practices like dumping artificially cheap goods and serve as pure geopolitical leverage to force better trade deals. It's a whole strategic toolkit. Moving on to Section 2, the Great Tariff Debate. So, we're faced with a pretty massive core trade-off. On one side, we have valid concerns about short-term consumer pain, and on the other, a strong focus on long-term national security and manufacturing independence. Let's look at the critics first. They point out that tariffs act as a regressive tax, hitting lower-income households the hardest, since everyday prices go up. They also warn that retaliation from other countries can severely hurt U.S. farmers who rely heavily on exporting their crops. But flip the script, and supporters argue this is an absolutely necessary defense. By making foreign goods more expensive, you're protecting local jobs, securing independence for critical goods, like medical supplies, and maintaining crucial leverage against intellectual property theft. Both sides are making heavily calculated arguments here. Which brings us to Section 3, the specialized goods problem. This is where the collateral damage comes in. Global trade relies on these massive, sweeping categories, like taxing all European cosmetics or all French leather goods. Because of that, highly specialized goods that don't even have a domestic equivalent simply get caught in the crossfire. Imagine a U.S. manufacturer who desperately needs a highly specialized European part, and there's literally no American alternative. Taxing that part doesn't protect an American industry, it just stalls economic activity. The parts become too expensive, domestic supply chains get disrupted, and consumer choice plummets. Economists call this a deadweight loss. It's a scenario where the retailer stops importing the good, you can't buy it, and the government collects zero tax revenue. It's a lose-lose-lose. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4. Echoes of the 1930s. Now, we can look at the 1880s Gilded Age, when tariffs were strictly for revenue before the income tax existed, or the 1970s Nixon shock, for some historical context. But trade historians overwhelmingly agree that the aggressive protectionism of the 1930s Smoot-Hawley era is our closest match today. Back in 1930, Congress raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to near record levels. 60%. Seriously, take a second to let that sink in. That is how much U.S. exports plunged after those 1930 tariffs spectacularly backfired. Foreign nations turned around, immediately retaliated, and completely devastated American agriculture and manufacturing basically overnight. And that sparked what we call the domino effect. Now, to be perfectly clear, Smoot-Hawley didn't directly cause World War II all on its own, but it absolutely acted as a desperate global catalyst. It turned a really severe recession into a fractured, completely hostile world. By choking off global trade, that tariff triggered a massive chain reaction of economic isolationism. We can track this tragic progression in 3 clear steps. Step 1, the U.S. essentially exported its depression to Europe. Germany's economy, which relied heavily on U.S. trade to pay off its war debts, completely shattered. And that bred the extreme political climate that allowed the Nazi Party to seize power. Step 2, resource-starved nations, particularly Japan, found themselves locked out of Western markets. This essentially forced their military leaders into imperial conquest just to secure basic resources like oil and rubber. And step 3, it completely fractured democratic alliances.
These bitter, beggar thy neighbor policies made allies so furious with one another that they couldn't form a united diplomatic front until it was way too late. This catastrophic breakdown, by the way, is exactly why the World Trade Organization was created decades later, to preserve peace through open, connected trade.
So that brings us to Section 5, today versus the past. Are we repeating history? Well, economists are definitely waving some red flags, warning that our current playbook mirrors the 1930s heavily, mostly in three specific areas. First off, average U.S. import duty rates are currently pushing right back up toward those Smoot-Hawley levels. Second, we are absolutely seeing immediate foreign retaliation. Nations like Canada and China are actively hitting our agriculture and energy sectors right now. And third, just like in 1930, we're seeing these universal duties being applied that end up angering both our adversaries and our close economic allies, like the European Union and Mexico. However, and this is a big however, we are not in a perfect one-to-one historical repeat. There are some absolutely crucial differences. Today, tariffs are often used as temporary bargaining chips to secure rapid trade deals. They aren't permanently etched into statutory law like they were back in the 30s. Plus, our entire economy looks completely different. We've shifted from being highly vulnerable and agriculture-heavy to having this massive, incredibly resilient domestic tech and services sector. But honestly, perhaps the most important difference is the stark contrast in legal oversight. Unlike the runaway legislative train of the 1930s, the U.S. judicial system today acts as a severe check and balance. Just look at the landmark February 2026 rollback. The Supreme Court actually stepped in and invalidated billions of dollars in emergency tariffs. They forced the government to pay out massive refunds to businesses and legally had to dial back those trade restrictions. Basically, the modern system actually has brakes. So, as you digest all of this information from today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Does the strategic leverage of modern tariffs outweigh the historical risks of global economic isolation? It's a huge question. We constantly have to weigh the immediate benefits of protecting our domestic supply chains against those profound domino effect risks that history has so brutally warned us about. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this complex topic. Keep analyzing the data, keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.